Gaming and entertainment journalist hacks love to attack anything that people cherish. They love to piss people off, and Lord of the Rings is always something they're trying to find an angle on so they can attempt to cancel one of the most beloved franchises of all time, and a new hit piece came out trashing it for being too slow, not having enough diversity, and also not enough female characters, which of course is absurd. I have a few things to show off, but before we get into the topic at hand, if you enjoy the content that I create, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Follow me on social media like Twitter or mine so that you can see when my content is posted. And of course, if you do really enjoy the videos and the live streams that I create, please consider becoming a Dark Titan via Patreon for just $1 a month, or support the channel via YouTube memberships. All of the links are in the description, and of course, I do really appreciate all of the support. So of course I am using an archive since I don't want to give CBR my clicks. It says 10 ways Lord of the Rings has aged poorly. This is a very classic example of a hit piece against something just to try to rile people up. Unfortunately, this is how these journalist hacks survive, or else they'd be getting 0 clicks. Again, that's why I use an archive so that I'm not giving them mine. It says, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien is largely responsible for modern fantasy. His idea to make a fairy story written for and read by adults proved to be incredibly popular, and his work continues to live on today. However, like many books that came out in the 1950s, some elements of Tolkien's work haven't aged particularly well, at least in their opinion, because of course they are attacking the dumbest things possible here. It says a book having outdated elements doesn't necessarily mean they are bad things. Just because certain elements of The Lord of the Rings have fallen out of fashion in contemporary literature doesn't mean they still can't be enjoyed. However, some parts of the book have aged poorly because they are problematic and offensive in ways that went uncorrected at the time. By their standard, it doesn't hold up and these themes are problematic. Most people don't care and appreciate what Tolkien created. Of course, we are talking about the Peter Jackson movies. I know that, Rings of Power is fresh in our minds because they're talking about the Lord of the Rings. We could go on and on about how those episodes are terrible, but of course these journalists don't want to attack bad content. They just want to attack things that they know people will be upset about. No one's upset about anyone attacking Rings of Power at this point because the show is just so bad. So we're gonna skim through them all pretty quickly, but numbers 10 to 5 are really generic BS. Number 10 is Tolkien's writing features plot cul-de-sacs for the sake of world building. Tolkien's Middle-earth is one of the most meticulously crafted fantasy settings in existence. Apart from The Lord of the Rings, he details the history of Middle-earth in the Silmarillion and had tons of personal notes on the world. While this makes for an incredibly rich setting, it occasionally resulted in clunky storytelling. The only Tolkien writing I've ever heard people say is clunky is the Silmarillion, and that's because it was more of just like a history book. It wasn't really one big story. It was just a lot of details being shoved at you very, very quickly. That I could understand, but he's basically saying that everything is a problem. Going to the Old Forest and meeting Tom Bombadil, readers are treated to many pages about a character who will soon disappear from the plot. While this establishes more about the world of Middle-earth, modern audiences are used to very streamlined stories and expect every chapter of a book to advance the main plot. Maybe this is the problem, is modern audiences are used to very streamlined stories. Maybe that's why entertainment is so trash now, because writers are too streamlined. Maybe that is a giant problem this writer didn't realize. 9 out of 10 is random characters show up for a short amount of time in The Lord of the Rings. Yes, there are a lot of characters who are being phased in, and in the next chapter they're being phased out, but again, they all matter to the plot and to the story. Of course, a running theme you're going to notice in this article is modern audiences, modern audiences. They say, however, for a second time, modern audiences have the perception that characters are dying and other dark elements make a work of fiction more realistic. Of course, this writer is basically just mad that it's not Game of Thrones. Then the article talks about how some characters lack agency, the story takes a while to get started, and then we get into diversity. Number 5 is the Lord of the Rings books lack diversity. Because Tolkien was largely inspired by white European history and myths, the Lord of the Rings is not a very diverse series of books. The main cast of characters is all presumed to be white based on the books, and even adaptations of the work reflect this lack of diversity. Representation in media matters, as some studies have suggested that positive representation can lead to greater acceptance of people who are othered. Of course, they do not actually provide these studies, but it says having a series of books featuring all white lead characters is a notion that feels dated with today's sensibilities. Now, yes, I do think that representation is a good and a positive thing, but at the same time, this is the way that these stories were written, and if you don't like it, go and write your own equivalent to The Lord of the Rings and put representation and diversity in it. You are free to do that. No one is telling you that you can't, but the problem is that they will never be happy unless we get a race swap, gender swap version of The Lord of the Rings where Aragorn is really a, female of color, and all of the companions are all these different types of races and genders and backgrounds, okay? They will never be happy with The Lord of the Rings, so instead they decide to write articles complaining instead of creating something that they think is good. Number 4 is some races in The Lord of the Rings are inherently evil. The classic monsters can't exist argument. Unless your evil character is a cis white male, it's bigoted and you're an ist. It's just more racial bigotry projected onto Tolkien. It also says the geography of Middle-earth is concerning because there's an east versus west dynamic, which is ridiculous since those are just directions, and any other connotation they're implying is just, again, another projection of their own real-world politics into a fantasy story. And then number 2 is Tolkien's work features uncomfortable racial terminology. While possibly not intentional on Tolkien's part, there are certain words he chooses to use that in a modern context raise a few eyebrows. Maybe you shouldn't be reading these in a modern context and just enjoy the creation for what it is. It says a clear example of this comes into chapter 10 when Aragorn is discussing the Nazgul, and the innkeeper says that no black man shall pass my doors while I stand on my legs, and also refers to the Nazgul using a slur. Yeah, of course they're talking about the Nazgul here. You know that if you actually were reading the book and you were actually taking in the content, but of course they want to take lines like this out of context and make it seem like Tolkien was a ragingist. And of course, number 1 is probably the most ridiculous in my opinion. They say Tolkien's world features very few women. The Lord of the Rings is largely a story about male characters. The female characters in Tolkien's world are largely sidelined or defined by their relationships to men in the story. By today's standards, this type of storytelling doesn't really hold up. Similar to ensuring that there is good representation across races, it is also important for media to portray characters of multiple genders. But they do! In these movies and in the books, female characters are extremely important, and it's funny that they're talking about the movies here, because Arwen's story was actually quite changed around between the movies and the books. In the books, she's a little bit more of a sidelined character, but they did make her very front and center in the movies, and they did give her a little bit more depth, a little bit more agency, actually. So it's funny that that still isn't even enough to them. Arwen, Eowyn, Galadriel, all fantastic female characters that of course they want to act like don't exist. As you can see, this article is one of the worst that I have had to sit through and read in a while. They're constantly talking about modern sensibilities, modern audiences, aka social justice warriors who are soft little snowflakes who get triggered over every little thing in entertainment and on the internet. It is sad that this is the article that CBR is putting out, that this is what entertainment journalism has come to, but as soon as I read this headline, I knew it was going to be awful, and as you can see, it really was. But that's all that I really had to talk about in this video. Let everyone know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to give it a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. And of course, if you didn't, make sure to give it a dislike. I appreciate your support either way, but I will talk to you all again in the next video really soon.